Chapter 8. Ideation. I name idea that upon which an individual's representation of the world, including hearer himself, is based once he is bound to the faithful subject type through incorporation within the process of a truth. The idea is that which makes the life of an individual, a human animal, orientate itself according to the true. Or put another way, the idea is the mediation between the individual and the subject of a truth, with subject designating here that which orientates a post-evental body in the world. This sense of the word idea instantiates my own interpretation of the Platonic idea, and particularly the idea of the good, to which a passage, as famous as it is enigmatic, is devoted in the Republic. By replacing the word good, used by too many moralizing theologies from the early Neoplatonists on, with that of true, we can obtain the following translation of Plato's words. Only inasmuch as it is in truth can that which is knowable be said to be known in its being. Yet to the idea of the true or truth, it owes not only its being known in its being, but also its known being itself, namely, that which of its being can only be said being, inasmuch as it is exposed to thought. Truth itself, however, is not of the order of that which is exposed to thought, for it is the raising up of this order, and therefore finds itself imparted distinct function, both in terms of precedence and of power. Plato's problem, which is still ours, is how our experience of a particular world, that which we are given to know, the knowable, can open up access to eternal, universal, and, in this sense, transmundane truths. For this to come about, according to Plato, this experience must be set out in truth, with this immanence being understood in the strict sense that only inasmuch as it is set out in the element of truth can a particular object of the world of our experience be said to be known, not only in its particularity, but in its very being. That this object of the world is then grasped in its being, he adds, is because there is situated in truth that share of the object which only is insofar as it is exposed to thought. We are, as a result, at the point where the being of the object is indiscernible from what of this being is thinkable. This point of indiscernibility between the particularity of the object and the universality of the thought of the object is exactly what Plato names the idea. Finally, as for the idea itself, given that it only exists in its power to bring forth the object in truth, and hence to uphold that there is something universal, it is not itself presentable because it is the presentation to the true. In a word, there is no idea of the idea. This absence, moreover, can be named truth. Exposing the thing in truth, the idea is true, and is therefore always the idea of the true, but the true is not an idea. The configuration I'm proposing, by way of philosophy's salvation, is basically a materialist transposition of this Platonic vision, unless, that is, Plato himself were already a materialist, and to have created a materialism of the idea. First, the individual supports of a possible thought that we human animals, capable of eternity, exist in the appearance of worlds that do not expose anything true by themselves. Worlds are only the matter of their transcendental logic, and we are examples amongst others of the play of differences and identities between multiples ruled by these logics. Second, it sometimes happens, event, or for Plato, conversion, that we are able to enter into the setting out of a truth. Admittedly, this process for us is neither an ascension nor linked to the death of a body and the immortality of a soul. It is, as Plato also knew, a dialectic, that of the incorporation of our individual life within the new body, constituted around the primordial statement, that trace of the event. In this way, we pass from the figure of the individual to that of the subject, Just as with the Greek master, we pass from sophistry, the cunning and truthless accommodation, to the differential laws of the world, to philosophy, except that in the place of philosophy we have art, science, politics, or love. Philosophy being for us but a secondary capture of these in the light of a concept of truth. Entering into the composition of a subject orientates our individual existence, while for Plato, dialectical conversion renders possible a just life. This entry into truth is what the idea brings about. If we replace ascending metaphors, one rises towards the idea from the world as perceived by the senses, by horizontal ones, the individual lives incorporated within the process of a body of truth's development are orientated in the world by this process in accordance with a heteronomous law, producing thereby a universal truth, the material of which is, nevertheless, completely particular. It is clear that the idea is nothing other than that by which individuals discover within themselves the action of thought as immanence to the true. This discovery immediately indicates both that the individual is not the author of this thought, but merely that through which it passes, and that this thought would, nevertheless, not have existed without all the incorporations which make up its materiality. Just as Plato is able to declare that the just life is achieved only by the dialectical opening up to ideas, so too I would declare that it is insofar as living individuals enter into truth and hence into the composition of a subjectivizable body that they experiment with the universal. For they know both that what they participate within is valid for everyone, with their participation thereby affording them no particular right, and that their life is, however, raised up and accomplished by having participated in this way in something beyond their simple subsistence. This knowledge is that of the idea. Let's say that a true life is the result of an ideation. Deleuze forcefully maintained against, it must be said, all the joyous, anarcho-desiring, and spontaneous interpretations of his philosophy that thinking is never a matter of voluntary decision or natural inclination. We are always, he declared, forced to think. Thought pushes us, as it were, from behind. It is neither lovable nor desired. Thought is a violence done unto us. I utterly agree with this view. It seems to me, moreover, to be altogether a Platonic one, who is not aware of the violence certainly charming and subtle, but no less implacable, that Socrates brings to bear upon his interlocutors. In what I'm proposing, there is a double constraint. First, there is the brutal contingency of the event that exposes us to a choice that we have not desired. Incorporation, indifference, or hostility, the faithful subject, the reactive subject, or the obscure subject. Then there is the construction, point by point, of the body which subjects individuals to previously unknown forms of discipline, whether it be a matter of new forms of mathematical demonstration, amorous fidelity, and party cohesion, or of giving up the delectation of long-established artistic forms for the sacrificial asperity of the avant-garde. This, too, is ideation, the representation of the universal power of something whose immediate particularity is very often perilous, unstable, and a source of anguish, by dint of being guaranteed by nothing at all. I would like to make this theory of the idea as the exposing of the mere individual to her/his becoming, subject as concrete as possible. Let's take, for example, the case of Cantor, the late 19th century inventor of mathematical set theory. The event in which his work originates is the history of analysis, and its wrestling with the notion of the infinite. At the start of the century, Cauchy's work had consisted in ridding differential and integral calculus of any reference to the infinitely small, which had, throughout the 18th century, both constituted Its underlying metaphysics had already been severely criticized by philosophers, Berkeley and Particular. A quantity A was said to be infinitely close to a quantity B if the difference of B was an infinitely small quantity. But what was meant by an infinitely small quantity? No one knew. Ch8 replaced all this by the dynamic notion of a series limit, thereby furnishing analysis with reliable, axiomatic foundations and jettisoning from mathematical thought any idea of the actual infinite. With Bolzano and Dedekind, however, the ontology of all this was understood to be too weak and, above all, largely physical or empiricist. When you say that a series tends towards a limit, the underlying schema is that of movement, with mathematics being, in fact, under the yoke of intuitions relating to the representation of space. To return to purely mathematical schemas, it was necessary to retackle the concept of the actual infinite and to assume that infinite quantities exist. But how can this be done if our idea of the infinite remains terribly vague, as was the case with the infinitely small? Cantor resolved this problem by creating the generic concept of set and by making new numbers. The ordinals and the cardinals correspond, through strictly rational procedures, to infinite sets. This most certainly constitutes one of the most admirable universal creations in the whole of human history. It is clear that the body of truth here is what achieves, in the world of calculus, a new appropriation of the predicate infinite for numbers from which this predicate was rationally separated. Any number, taken rigorously, measured by definition, a finite quantity. As to how Cantor achieved his own incorporation within the process of this new truth, this was through an extraordinarily tormented ideation. Indeed, he fully grasped that the thought passing through him, in which he was one of the first to organize, equally radically changed mathematical rationalities, relations to philosophy, and to religion. Until his breakthrough, the infinite had been linked to the one, in the conceptual form of the God of religions or metaphysical systems. The domain of human thought was the finite, with our being essentially creatures doomed to finitude. This is the very reason why, moreover, Ch8 strictly kept the notion of limit away from any form of compromise with an actual infinite. With Cantor, the infinite was to enter into the domain of the multiple. Not only did he assume the actual existence of infinite multiplicities, but he demonstrated that there exists an infinity of different infinites. That being the case, how then was one to deal with the relation between human animals' thought, the individual Cantor as incorporated within the deployment of the rational theory of infinite numbers, and the supposition of a transcendence, the individual Cantor as a faithful Christian, if the opposition of the finite and infinite, or the multiple and the one, no longer suffices? Cantorian ideation deals wholly with this point and is, as a result, the exposure to thought of the radical, transgressive, and universal innovation of its own invention. From then on, Cantor was to seek a way of introducing the difference between the mathematical infinite and the theological infinite within the very concept of the infinite, without being greatly convinced himself. He was to write to the Roman Curia to seek counsel. He was also to go mad. Here, then, we can understand the way in which ideation organized his heroic determination and his demonstrative discipline right up to the limits of the unintelligible, after having given a rigorous proof of the fact that the set of rational numbers, the fractions, is denumerable, and hence that these numbers, contrary to our entire immediate intuition, are not more numerous than natural whole numbers. He was to exclaim, "I see it, but I don't believe it." However, we also understand the way in which, on the other hand, ideation organized and modified the relation of the individual Cantor to the ordinary world, expressing his quality of an animal of this world who, tormented and almost shattered by the ontological violence of his thinking incorporation, was nevertheless not to give in. Schema 2, found inside the back cover flap, presents truth's complete trajectory and is, therefore, a sort of condensation of the whole of logics of worlds. There is no question of our commenting on it here in detail. We will simply signal that the line which goes from indifferent multiplicities to the evental rupture organizes the objective supports of a truth's construction, which are really given in a world, whereas the line which goes from the event to eternal truths sets out the subjective categories induced by individuals' incorporation within the becoming of this truth. Between these two lines, there is a vertical correspondence. For example, as we have explained, the subjective trace of an event is nothing other than the raising up of an inexistent. Likewise, the condition of an existence belongs to the transcendental. Or again, the organs of a body of truth serve to deal with the points of the world under the form of a radical choice, and so on. If one admits that ideation is that which, in the individual undergoing incorporation within the process of a truth, is responsible for binding together the components of this trajectory, then one understands that it is that through which a human life is universalized at the cost, clearly, of difficult problems with its particularity. The idea is the severity of the sense of existence. Alain Badiou, Second Manifesto, For Philosophy.